Hello! So in this unit we're going to be learning about how to show disjunctions in general. The strategy we've been using in the past is not fully general in a certain way, and so we're going to be learning about that. But it involves learning about how negations and disjunctions interact, because we're going to be going via showing disjunctions with indirect derivation, where the assumption we get is the negation of a disjunction. So in this video and the next, I'm going to be talking about negated disjunctions and negations and disjunctions and conjunctions more generally, and then we'll see how to actually we'll learn the strategy for showing disjunctions in general. So, and I just need to make clear one piece of terminology. So I'm going to use the word entails in this video. What does entails mean? I think we've talked about this before, but just to review, we can say that one sentence entails another, and what that means is that the argument from the first sentence to the second, whose premise is the first sentence and whose conclusion is the second sentence, that argument is valid. And another way of saying that is to say that no matter what, when we say that box entails circle, that means no matter what, circle is true if box is true, and that's because of the logical form of the sentences. But the important point is that when we say this, we're saying that if no matter what, if box is true, then so is circle, but not necessarily vice versa. Okay, so here are 4 sentences that we're going to be looking at in this module or in this video. It's not the case that P and Q. It's not the case that P, and also it's not the case that Q. It's not the case that either P or Q, which we could say also neither P nor Q, and either it's not the case that P or it's not the case that Q. So let's start by looking at it's not the case that P and it's not the case that Q, and compare that with it's not the case that P or it's not the case that Q. The first one means P and Q are both false. It's a conjunction. Both the conjuncts are true. They're the conjuncts are negations of P and Q, so we're saying the negation of P is true and the negation of Q is true, so we're saying that P and Q are both false. The disjunction says that either P is false or Q is false, but it doesn't tell us that they're both false. The disjunction is true when only one of its disjuncts is true, so it's true when either negation P is true, but negation Q isn't, or when negation Q is true, but negation P isn't. So this leaves open that one of P or Q might be true, or it requires at least one of P or Q be false, but it doesn't require that they both be false. So if negation P and negation Q is true, let's suppose that it is. That means that, among other things, negation P is true, and that means that negation P or negation Q is true. And so negation P and negation Q entails negation P or negation Q. And we could have made this point by going through negation Q instead of negation P in the middle. It doesn't matter. Negation P and negation Q just says a lot more than negation P or negation Q. So we can say that negation P and negation Q entails negation P or negation Q. The green arrow means entails. Okay, well, what about in the other direction? Well, suppose that P is true and Q is false. Okay, well, that means that negation P is false because P is true, but it means negation Q is true because Q is false. Okay, so that means that the conjunction, so the disjunction is true, right? Q is false, so negation Q is true, so negation P or negation Q is true because it's right disjunct, negation Q is true. On the other hand, negation P and negation Q, that's false. Why? Well, P is true, so negation P is false, so the left conjunct is true, so the conjunction, P is true, negation P is false, so the left conjunct is false, and so the conjunction is false. So we have a situation where negation P or negation Q is true, but negation P and negation Q is false. And so does negation P or negation Q entail negation P and negation Q? No, it doesn't. That's not really a surprise. The disjunction is weaker than the conjunction. It doesn't say as much. So we can have a red arrow going from negation P or negation Q to negation P and negation Q. Okay, good. Let's now compare negation P and negation Q with negation of P and Q. So this new sentence, we ask, is it the case that both P and Q? And this says no. So what it says is that the conjunction is false. All that requires is that one of the conjuncts be false. So this basically says the same thing as negation P or negation Q. It says at least one of P or Q is false. Is the conjunction, is it the case that they're both true? No, it's not the case that they're both true. And there's only one way they can both be true. P's true and Q's true, and we're saying that's the one situation we're not in. Okay, so let's look at the entailment relations between these two sentences. So let's first suppose that negation P and negation Q is true. That means that negation P is true. That means that P is false. That means that P and Q is false. That means that negation P and Q is true. And that means that negation P and negation Q entails negation of P and Q. So we can add another green arrow to our diagram here, showing that negation P and negation Q entails negation of P and Q. Now let's think about the other direction. So let's suppose that P is true and Q is false. Well, that means that negation P is false. If P is true, so negation P is false. So negation of P and negation Q, that conjunction, that's false because its left conjunct is false. On the other hand, P and Q is false. Why? Well, Q is false. And so negation of P and Q is true. So what do we have? We have a situation where negation of P and Q, that's true. But negation of P and negation of Q, that's false. So negation of P and Q does not entail negation P and negation Q. So again, we can have a red arrow here saying no. Again, the sentence in the bottom right does not entail a sentence in the top left. All right, good. So we've talked about 3 of our sentences. Let's now talk about the relationship between negation P and negation Q with negation of P or Q. So this says, is the sentence P or Q, is that true? No. Well, when is P or Q true? There are 3 ways it can be true. Either P and Q are both true, or P is true and Q is false, or Q is true and P is false. And so when we negate P or Q, we're saying we're in none of those situations. And the only way we can be in none of those situations is if both P and Q are false. So let's think about the entailment relations again. So let's suppose that negation of P and negation of Q is true. That means that negation P and negation Q are both true, and that means that P and Q are both false. Well, if P and Q are both false, then P or Q is false, and therefore negation of P or Q is true. And so if negation of P and negation of Q, if that's true, then also negation of P or Q is also true. So we can say that on this top sentence, the top row of our diagram, the left sentence entails the right sentence. Now let's think about how it goes in the other direction. Let's suppose that negation of P or Q is true. That means P or Q is false. And the only way that can happen is if both P and Q are false, which means that negation of P and negation Q are both true. That means that negation of P and negation of Q is true. And that means that the negation of the disjunction entails the conjunction of the negations. So that means that we can draw a green arrow from right to left. So in fact, the sentences on the top row say the same thing, in the sense that they say it in different ways, but they say the same thing. They are always true, or they're both true, or they're both false. They're logically equivalent. So we can just draw an arrow in either direction. Now, also, it turns out that the top right entails the bottom left. Why? Well, if the top right is true, then the top left is true. And we know that if the top left is true, then the bottom left is true. So if the top right is true, then the bottom left is true. And for the same reason, the top right entails the bottom right. If the top left is true, then if the top right is true, then the top left is true. And if the top left is true, then the bottom right is true. So if the top right is true, then the bottom right is true. So what we have here is everything on the top row entails everything on the bottom row. What about the 2 sentences on the bottom row? On the one hand, we have negation. What about the relationship between the sentences on the bottom row? Well, I'm not going to argue for it here, but as it turns out, we can also show that they're equivalent. In fact, for your homework, you're going to do derivations that show that the top row is equivalent, that those two sentences, that there's the biconditional between them is a logical truth, is a theorem, and you're also going to do a derivation that shows that the biconditional formed by the bottom sentences is also a logical truth or a theorem. Actually, I'm going to show you how to do the top one, and then you'll still have to do it also for homework, but I'm going to show you how to do it. And you'll have to figure out how to do the bottom one a little bit on your own, but the derivation of the top one will be helpful. So what this video, though, shows is that there are these different relationships between conjunctions and disjunctions and negations. And we need to be careful where we have, when we think about, okay, I have a conjunction and I have negation, or I have a disjunction and negations. Am I negating the disjuncts, or am I negating the disjunction? Is the sentence I'm looking at a negation of a conjunction, or is it a conjunction of negations? And as we can see, those sentences say different things, right? So we want to be careful and do our best to try to keep these different sentences apart.